Hey guys, Brian Wilson, partially examined life, not school. Take two, because the internet went down. Doing St. Augustine's Confessions, book 1 through 3. And my opening question is, are there any declarative statements in the reading at all? Did we notice anything that was like, that we could say is some kind of, this is how the universe works, this is how humanity works, this is how God works? Anything like that?
I think so. In the part where he's talking about infancy and how he doesn't remember it himself, but he thinks he can get an idea of what it's like by observing other babies. I mean, it's kind of like an implied... There's an implication there that you can learn about yourself by observing other people, even if you don't have a memory of your own experience.
I think that's a great jumping off point. What struck me significantly throughout the reading is how observant he was about kind of the meta and the not so meta parts of human existence, but trying to fit it in this framework of almost his specialized brand of Christianity seemed to confuse me at times. He criticizes kind of the society that he's in as lacking what I would call ethics, but he doesn't really use that term. And then in book 3, we, start to see a little bit of him interacting with Christians, specifically the Manichees. Am I pronouncing that right?
Are they Christian, Manichaeans? I thought they were Persian.
I was under the impression that that was a sect within Christianity, and that's what I could be totally wrong about that.
I think they're Gnostic, which is a kind of a weird combination. I thought. Yeah.
I thought that they were basically some kind of sect.
Well, they had beliefs that were definitely not Christian.
Right. But we do also get in book 3 where he starts to, and I mean, this is, still in his late teens. I'm looking at book 3, part 6 in my translation, and I'm using the Sheed translation. This is what it looks like in case you guys have the same one. I fell in with a sect of men talking high-sounding nonsense, carnal and wordy men. The snares of the devil were in their mouths to trap souls with an arrangement of the syllables of the names of God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, and of the Paraclete, the Holy Ghost, our Comforter. These names were always on their lips, but only as sounds and tongue noises, for their heart was empty of the true meaning. So he's describing his life as a late teen, early adult. I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Sam, you got some headphones on or no?
I do have headphones. Is that probably doing it?
You said you don't have headphones, or you do?
I do have headphones. Cause it?
No, headphones don't cause it. Headphones fix it. But okay, it's gone now. Weird. Let me give you a little taste of what I'm kind of scratching towards. And it's right in the beginning, and this is also something we can talk about with Jim and his confusion with or not confusion, but his issue with the language. Let's look at paragraph 2 or section 2 in book 1. I'm just going to read most of this. But how can I call unto my God and Lord? For in calling unto him, I am calling him to me. And what room is there in me for my God, the God who made heaven and earth? Is there anything in me, O God, that can contain you? All heaven and earth cannot contain you, for you made them, and me in them. Yet since nothing that is could exist without you, you must in some way be in all that is, therefore also in me, since I am. And if you are already in me, since otherwise I should not be, why do I cry to you to enter into me? Even if I were in hell, you would be there, for if I go down to hell, there art there also. Thus, O God, I should be nothing, utterly nothing, unless you were in me, or rather, unless I were in you, of whom and by whom and in whom are all things. So it is, Lord, so it is. Where do I call you to come, since I am in you? Or where else are you that you can come to me? Where shall I go beyond the bounds of heaven and earth, that God may come to me, since it is said, heaven and earth do I fill? So I'm approaching this from this idea of observant, right, that Russ talked about too, with the idea of observing human nature through looking at other experiences of infants and extrapolating that to yourself. I'm also looking at this from this seems to be somebody who is devoted to a reading, I won't say literal, but a reading of the scriptures that's very specific, and one that he is pointing out, whether accidentally or on purpose, all the contradictions inherent in scripture, right? And we get to a certain part of this, right, that I'd love you guys' thoughts on, where he seems to lay out a very specific and concise declarative statement, but one that also, I think, contradicts itself, and maybe it doesn't, and I'm just reading it badly. Book 3, section 7. This is also listed as paragraph 13. And this is right after he's talking about the kind of false godly people. And he says, nor did I know that true and inward righteousness, which judges not according to custom, but according to the most righteous law of Almighty God. By that law, the ways of conduct of different places and times are shaped as is best for those places and time, though the law itself is always and everywhere the same. Not different in different places or changing with the ages. By this righteousness, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David and all those others praised by God were righteous, although they are judged not so by ignorant men who apply the tests of their human minds and measure all the conduct of human race by the measure of their own custom. And then the rest of that is how changing custom is wrong. So we have this measuring stick of what God declares to be righteous is always righteous, even though it's different in different times. But that if custom changes, that isn't right, that's not righteous or just, if custom changes to decide what's righteous and just. But you can do that with God's law. And so for me, these kind of contradictions stand out. For me, that's a contradiction. It doesn't necessarily make sense, because he also says applying the tests of their human mind. So whether you're a Christian with a human mind or a non-Christian with a human mind, you're still applying it to your Christian mind. And you also have this, it's interesting that he brings this up right after that paragraph prior where he's talking about these kind of false Christians. And his impression is that they're false Christians, that what is in their heart is not Christianity. And so kind of throughout, I'm looking for declarative statements, concise declarative statements, because I feel like in that first paragraph that I wrote, or first paragraph that I read, that doesn't make sense to me, right? It doesn't seem clear or concise to me when you describe God is everywhere and he's nowhere. God is in me and not in me. I am in God and he is in me. If I look at that from a purely geometric standpoint, if you have a circle and a point, either the point's inside the circle, the point is on the circle, the point is outside the circle. So you have this kind of clear geometrical understanding that I'm trying to apply to a certain extent to this, which might not work. But I feel like throughout the reading, there's some kind of desire to understand the universe, to observe and understand the universe. But then the way he describes it seems contradictory in a lot of ways. So I'm just wondering, is that formulation incorrect? Which it probably is. And if so, what are his declarative statements that don't do this hedging? You're in me, I'm in you, you're in hell, you're here, you're everywhere, you're nowhere, which I feel like are throughout. And what are the things that are very specifically things that we can say, yes, this declarative statement is true? Does that make any sense?
What do you see as the contradiction?
Well, he says, judging by human minds, for that sentence right there. How can you not judge them with human minds? If you're a human, you're going to judge them with human minds, right?
Right.
And then the rest of that paragraph is about how custom changes, the idea of justice within certain societies changes, and that is not okay. That God is allowed to shift what he feels is just and who he feels is righteous, depending on the times. And it seems like he has a strong defense of that throughout the rest of that section. But that if human law changes, evolves, adjusts, whatever you want to call it, that's wrong.
Well, he
yeah.
does say something about justice just a little bit later. I don't think he thinks you're right. Yeah, you're right. It does kind of seem like he's saying, well, it can be one thing one day and one thing the other. But I mean, he says, a little bit later in 7, he says, this does not mean that justice is erratic or variable, that the times over which it presides are not always the same, for it is the nature of time to change. Man's life on earth is short, and he cannot, by his own perception, see the connection between the conditions of earlier times and of other nations, which he has not experienced himself, and those of his own times, which are familiar to him. So he's, I mean, and I had thought of this earlier as, well, I mean, in this way, it's going to turn out that justice it doesn't really mean anything. That it can God can change it and apply it differently. But I mean, I think this passage or this kind of talk is actually helpful for modern readers, actually, because it's easier to adapt it to times as they change, because he's saying different things are appropriate at different eras. So it's actually, I think it's that he provides a little bit of flexibility there. But what you're right, he's trying to grasp at is what the core of that flexibility is, I think, and that's probably the more interesting question, is what he thinks the grounding of that kind of flexibility and interpretation is, maybe.
But he's not entirely a relativist, because then he goes on later to say, and I think I have a different translation, but same book. Can it at any time or place be unjust to love God with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his mind, and his neighbor as himself? Therefore are those foul offenses which be against nature to be everywhere and at all times detested and punished. And then he goes on talking about some of those things. But it's clear that he does think that some things are always wrong and some things are always right, even if customs change and traditions change.
Russ, forgive me, but do you have like those of the men of Sodom in your translation? Because mine has that right in the middle of that second sentence.
Yeah, the sin.
Brian, you're not coming in. Is it just me? Or Brian's not coming in clear?
I think my internet might be a little wonky, guys. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
I have that about Sodom in my translation. Where exactly was that?
This is 3:8.
Yeah.
Russ, do you have anything about Sodom in your translation?
Oh yeah. That's what came right after that. Such as were those of the men of Sodom, etc.
Yeah. I mean, that's like, it's super groovy with, treat your neighbor as yourself. I'm on board. That makes sense, right? This makes sense to me. And I think that the problem, though, is then he just applies it to Sodom, which throws me off a little bit, right? It's like, love your neighbor as yourself, treat them as you would. Not if they're gays, not the gays. They don't get that. So what I'm seeing like throughout this, and like I might be just overly framing this in a bad reference system, is he rebels against his schooling, right? Really doesn't dig it. Really, but also kind of chastises himself, right? Says, I should have paid more attention to math, even though I really just dug literature, right? I was just really into Virgil. I was really into plays, and I was really just into playing with, my schoolmates, right? I really wasn't into learning math. And he got beat up by his teachers and was kind of laughed at by his parents because, hey, that's the way the world works. you have to do this. And so part of him wants to rebel against that. And so I'm wondering, and this might beg for psychoanalysis, which we may want to avoid too much, but if you're used to a sadist type of structure where you can never be worthy of considering yourself a good person, you're always falling short, and you need some kind of punishment to do that, but you still need to rebel in some way. What better way to do that than through religion, right? Where you go from one system of you have to live a certain way even though it's contrary to potentially human nature, and if you don't do that, you're going to be punished, right? And so I think that's why a lot of the kind of biographical parts are very interesting to me, because he lays out a system that he was in that was very, I think, similar to the system that he found afterwards. Am I extrapolating over much?
Well, I think that does make sense. I mean, it does seem in here like it's overblown from the distance that we're looking at it. Like, oh, you didn't study as hard as you should have, so you were beaten for it, and that made you feel bad. But I mean, I think if we give it makes sense in the sense that we a lot of times do things that we like to do so much that they exclude things that we do know that we should be doing otherwise. I mean, that's not like an unreal feeling that people have. I could go play video game. I could be playing video games right now instead of this, but I chose to go do this because I think this is fun and interesting to do. But so it's not all, yeah, he does have a little hyperbole, I think, from our perspective.
Yeah, I'm just, I'm stuck on, another way to frame the opening question is, is there anything declarative about God in here? Because he seems to pull a lot of different stuff from Scripture. Sorry, I'm in an Airbnb and there's bugs in here that I'm trying to kill rapidly. Great video production quality with me trying to kill bugs in the background. But, he'll drop these Scripture pieces in here. And for me, it doesn't help me understand what he's talking about. If anything, it's his prose is a bridge between the Scripture points, but his Scripture points to a certain degree are developing an argument and then putting Scripture in there to back up that argument. And that's why, in order just to understand it, like, I'm not trying to automatically tear this thing down, right? I'm really trying to just understand. I probably did this with Plato, with Symposium too, where I was just like, all right, I want to understand what are the declarative parts. And that's why we kind of really dug in to, Socrates' speech about what is love, because he didn't come down with a declarative statement about what is love either. So I'm really just trying to figure out, what are the declarative parts of this section that we can really root ourselves in.
You say it's pretty clear God created everything. That he says pretty clearly that God created the world, everything we see, right?
Yeah,
and that's it. And then he also says, Book 1, "From thee, O God, are all good things, and from my God is all my health." So God is a source of all good things. And then there's kind of the question mark, though, comes when it has to do with evil, right? Because he says God is in hell, which is kind of a weird idea. And then if God created everything, did God create evil things as well? Which, again, kind of seems contradictory. So I'm not sure, just after reading this once, how he resolves that tension.
Yeah, but, he, number one, he's relating this in hindsight as a middle-aged man. But what I got out of it was, in the particular parts we've read, is he's refuting the Manichaean principles. The Manichaeans believed that God was some kind of physical substance, and he's saying that can't be, that God must be some spiritual entity, and if he's in heaven, he must be everywhere. He must be in hell. He must be in me, or am I in him? He's refuting all of these beliefs that he said he was seduced by the Manichaeans to believe, one by one. It seems to me the whole, at least the first 3 chapters, is a declaration. The declaration is, what I believed when I was young was false, and I found the true belief in Christianity.
And that sounds right to me, but it also sounds like, he's thirsting to a degree for some system to make sense of the world, right? And there's a significant ethical component to this that he's trying to figure out as well. And he uses the 10 Commandments as, part of that, and he compares them to a harp in my translation, where he says the 3 and the 7 and the 10 like a Roman harp or something like that.
Brian, you said he was espousing a particular type of Christianity before.
Mm-hmm.
What did you mean by that?
Well, just that he was rejecting and in this part, this is 3:6, and my chapter titles say the fantasies the Manichees offered when he hungered for real food, especially their corporeal notion of God. Even though in my translation he doesn't say the Manichees specifically, but he. It sounds to me, this is similar, the paragraph there at the beginning of 3:6 sounds very similar, like Socrates and the rhetoricians, right? So that they're kind of espousing maybe the right philosophy some of the time, but it's mainly just about how they look to other people, right? What impression they're trying to give to other people, not a real philosophical foundation, not a real love of wisdom. And so he digs into this and he rejects it, and talks about the bishop at the end of the reading that also, rejected Manichaeism. And I guess my point with that was just that, there's these flaws of the human mind that he talks about in relation to justice and in relation to the people, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David, who were righteous according to God, but that the human mind can't, let me try to get the wording exactly right. And David and all those others praised by God were righteous, although they are judged not so by ignorant men who apply the tests of their human minds and measure all the conduct of the human race by the measure of their own custom. When do you not do that? How is it possible to not do that? And how is it possible to read the Bible where you have seemingly a different ethical standard, depending on what time it is, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, and what's specifically going on in each of those? How do you not judge it with the human mind? How do you not judge it against the custom of your time? How do you not do that?
Well, for one thing, does everybody else's says mine? Mine says human standards. I don't know if that makes a difference, like that he has that he thinks anything that we're going to think about is automatically going to be thought about in human minds. That makes sense, but
so I've got a little asterisk on mine that says, can also be interpreted as who judge by man's day.
Okay.
And this is, I'll cheat real quick and look this up because I didn't look it up ahead of time. Corinthians.
Yeah, mine says, but they were judged unrighteous by unskillful people, judging out of human judgment and measuring all mankind in general by the model of their own customs. And then he goes on to explain about a man in armor being ignorant of how the armor works, and is apparelled with the armor all over his body in the wrong place.
Mm-hmm. And so this is, I have another reference here that says this is a reference to Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 4, verse 3, and it says, I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. And at that time, each will receive their praise from God. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
so Brian, it seems like your issue is like, how can human beings judge or make moral judgments outside of their own perception?
mm-hmm.
So this is kind of moral relativism in general,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know, how can there be an objective morality that exists outside of any subjective consciousness?
Yeah.
Right. So it's a larger issue beyond religion. You can, you know, there are people who are atheists who believe in objective morality.
Mm-hmm.
But is that a fair statement? You know, in Christianity, you're dealing with supposedly revealed truths, and you know, it begs the question of who's interpreting the revealed truths. But that was the big split between Protestantism and the Catholic Church. Protestants believe that every man could interpret scriptures correctly or to his own purpose, whereas the Church holds that in matters of morals and say revelation, that all men have to submit their reason and will to the Church. So, you know, the Pope interprets the revealed tradition, and wasn't Augustine breaking new ground here? Wasn't he one of the first people that said we don't have to look at the Bible as a literal document, that we can look at it as metaphors or metaphorically?
Well, yeah, I don't know when people started thinking of it as quite literal. Yeah, I don't know the history of kind of biblical interpretation. I know that there were other guys before him who had some thoughts that would be considered questionable nowadays according to the church. So it definitely wasn't as strict of a system back then. Obviously, I mean, this is only like 400 AD or something.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of subjective morality is, I think, important, right? Because I think it asks the same question that I'm asking, as when is there not subjective morality? I mean, if you say, my objective reality is what the Bible says is morality, I feel like that's still a moral relativism, right? You're saying, this book is my guide, relative to that is immoral. This is moral, relative to that is immoral. It's still your subjective sense of morality, you know? So,
but there's a way around this, Brian, which that you might believe that objective morality exists. However, my capacity to perceive it is inherently flawed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right.
I like that.
You can make an analogy with science. You know, no measurement is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
You know, no theory is 100% proven. But that doesn't mean that objective reality doesn't exist. It just means that mankind's ability to perceive it is inherently flawed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that puts a nice point to it. And I think it also leads to the conception of, how do you know you're right? You know, like how does Augustine know to reject Manichaeism? How is he sure of what's in another man's heart, you know? And especially talking about judgment, you know, judge not lest ye be judged jumps into my mind, and saying that all human judgment is an error, right? Unless it maybe there's an out there that says unless it's perfectly in keeping with what God says, which is kind of what he says in that section about Sodom. But then I look at that and I go, that's problematic, right? But I mean, I also, I feel like they're, you can't, whether or not you're a complete atheist or complete, like Catholic and like an Augustinian tradition, I think that there is stuff in here that's where the ethical and the religious come together, right? If there's a Venn diagram and you draw them in, there's stuff that is both ethical and religious, right? And so religion has said this is God's command, and a atheist humanist might say it's ethical, right? And then there's other stuff that's outside of that, where the atheist humanist that believes in some type of quasi-objective ethics would go, all right, this is ethical, and then you have this flip side of, well, this is religious, right? And so you would have this, especially the conception of Sodom, saying there's some things that are really wrong, and being a gay, top of that list, right? And the atheist humanist might go, I don't know if I buy that, right? And I just think that that's and this is wonderful that this is an example of the declarative statement, because we can kind of dig into that a little bit. That's a hard sell for me to say, I know, two things are true. Like, and the section that Russ read is a perfect example. In no time or place could it be wrong for a man to love God, his whole heart, and his whole soul, and his whole mind, and his neighbor as himself. I'm in that little Venn diagram there. Sounds good, right? And then, therefore, those sins which are against nature, like those of men of Sodom, are in all times and places to be tested and punished, right? Now you get this separation of the religious and the ethical, right? And so I'm interested in these declarative parts to try to tease out those differences and see if they exist. They might exist. This Venn diagram is just something I made up, and I'm using a lot of vogue hand signals to imitate. And it's interesting because, this is held up as the sin that's always a sin, right? Could have gone with murder. We could have gone with thievery. We could have gone with rape. We could have gone something where I'm still in that ethical piece, and I'm going to buy into that if I'm an atheist humanist. But because he goes in this other direction, it's something that you can potentially tease apart and say, all right, well, I don't necessarily buy that. And if I don't buy that, what else am I going to not buy in here? What are the ethical pieces in here that anybody can say, yeah, this really makes sense? Like flaws in subjective reality. That makes sense. I'm on board with that. Love your neighbor as yourself. I'm on board with that. Men of Sodom will always be detested and punished.
Well,
maybe not.
One thing, when I know we always talk about, when we hear about Sodom and Gomorrah, we always associate this with like homosexuality immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that's actually reflected in the text, or is this just a conflation that has happened over the years? Is it just
I can answer that.
Is it just profligate sexual behavior? Is it like literally?
Specifically, it's homosexual rape in the actual text.
Huh. Okay.
I remember there's a group of people sent to Sodom and Gomorrah, and then the horny men are knocking on their door trying to drag them out and rape them.
Sure.
But it doesn't, at least from what I remember, it doesn't explicitly say that. It doesn't explicitly universally condemn homosexuality. And honestly, the Bible doesn't make that much of a big deal about homosexuality, which kind of raises an interesting question. Why is, kind of what Brian said, why is this the one sin that he's so certain is wrong everywhere in all times, when he also says elsewhere that there are other things that were right at this time and wrong in that time? So it's just kind of a weird example to pick, and it doesn't seem biblically based to me. Well, so maybe it's something, maybe it's a personal insecurity of his.
Well, that
quite plausible.
My reasoning behind asking that was that, so we have the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah in that story, and it, just for the sake of argument, let's just say it may or may not have anything to do with our notions of sexual orientation now, but it's more to do with what was that word I used earlier? Sexual profligacy, if I'm gonna get on my $10 words. But and we hear earlier in these books him chastising himself over and over for the same thing, that he was just trying to have sex with everybody all the time. He was just a wastrel. He was just doing nothing good with his time. And so he obviously thinks that if I'm going to be super charitable to him, I'm going to say that what really he's not, he's kind of chastising any of this kind of behavior that's just wasteful and not, I don't know, maybe not constructive, or just he's getting wrapped up in his own lust or anything like that. Maybe that's why he thinks it's always a sin against nature, because it's just an overabundance of lust and stuff like that. If I want to be charitable to Augustine.
Russ, you made a distinction, forcible rape versus homosexuality. You could very well make a case that the forcible rape was the sin.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think that was, yeah. No, I dig your point, Russ. And there's an interesting, talking about this conception of ethics and religion, it's right in paragraph 16 in my translation. This is a little further down in 3:8, where he's talking about in sins where there is a real harm, a real will to harm another. It may either be calumny or injury. And these are the main heads of sin. I'm jumping down. These are the main heads of sin, which swarm forth from lust for holding the first place, or lust of the eye, or lust of the senses, or from any one or two of them, or from all together. By these we live evilly against the 3 and the 7, the 10 commandments, right? And so this is where I see, again, this kind of like very much harmony between an ethical conception and a religious conception, and saying, yeah, if you want to harm someone else, right, bad juju, not good. Where does this stem from is a wonderful question, right? It's like, where does this stem from? And so he lists those out right in that paragraph. It's revenge, gain, escape from danger, envy, pleasure in another's suffering. Those are his heads of sin, right? Those are his pieces of sin. All of those things make perfect sense to me, right? They're all things which could potentially cause harm to another human being, right? So from an ethical standpoint, you say, okay, yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me. But you don't need the 10 commandments for any of that, right? Necessarily. You even get to the 10 commandments, so yeah, it's just like, oh no, by the way, the 10 commandments cover this, right? Which is cool. Okay, we're on board. But there's still this kind of maturation of his thought processes, of his conception of religion, that I'm not super clear on. Granted, we're only 3 books in, right? Let's meet up tomorrow and do the next 3. It's a cliffhanger.
Can you make a case that we shouldn't even be talking about religious considerations? So when you look at religious customs across the whole spectrum, some of them are patently absurd and ridiculous. Why not just stick with the ethical considerations as to what is the right thing to do, rather than what is the custom that we should observe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think he's trying to tackle that to a certain extent. There's some innate drive in here with his level of observational skill, which I think is relatively high, right? With his eloquence, which for me is relatively high. Like I enjoyed the prose. It was kind of tough to dig through initially because I'm like, where's he going with this? But once I got into his language a little bit, it made a little bit more sense. But then it's just this humility, right? And this certainty that are a little tough, right? I mean, if you look at 3:10, but I knew nothing of all this, and so I derided those, your holy servants and prophets. I gained nothing by mocking them, except that I should myself be mocked by you. So at one part of his life, he's going, this is totally wrong, right? And in another part of his life, he's going, totally right. But it's his interpretation of what's totally right, right? It's not the Manichees. It's not, a wide sweeping sect of Christianity. It seems it's just his interpretation. And he's very unclear about even what God is. So he's trying to answer some kind of questions, but he's not, I don't think, stating those questions very clearly for me, but he's trying to propose an answer, right? Which for him is Christianity. His version of Christianity is the answer. But I don't know if I know the question that he's trying to ask, I guess is another way to put it.
I think I do. I think it's the question of sin.
Okay.
And, you gave the reasons for the sins in the Ten Commandments, like jealousy of others. But I think the best example of sin is, I think it's book 2 where he talks about stealing pears.
Mm-hmm.
All right, the infamous pears.
You guys remember that? That was a very important episode because he specifically says, look, I didn't need the pears. Most of the time I didn't eat them. I threw them away, right? And they weren't even very good pears. But I just enjoyed the simple act of doing it because it was wrong. So from like an evolutionary perspective or from like an economics perspective, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around this if you assume that man is rational. So why do we have these self-destructive or society-destructive behaviors even when there's no inherent gain to ourselves immediately, which I think is still a relevant question to this day. And then he also says something really interesting, was that he would not have stolen the pears had he been by himself. He only did it because he was in a group. And he doesn't quite provide an explanation for that, but it is an important observation.
It has something to do with the manifestation of the sin that it was committed by the group, whereas at that stage of his life he knew better to do it individually. You go back to when he was a baby, isn't he making the case that all humans are corrupted and somehow he is searching to find his way out of that corruption, and his mother is praying and crying every night that he'll find his way to Christianity, which she believes is the answer. And he gets there, but he does it through searching. He went, he studied under Ambrose, the bishop that also disagreed with the Manichaeans, and he did his due diligence to find what he thinks is the right answer. But he's also, I think he's opening up original material, because a lot of what's taught in the Catholic Church today is what Augustine brought to the table. It was not there before him.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff about, that it all comes back to the Paris, right? It's like it all comes back to the cigar with Freud. He's got this line in book 1 at the end of 7. You have ordained, and so it is, that every disorder of the soul is its own punishment, right? Which I like, in which the footnote is Romans 2:15, which I pulled up, and they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. And there's another very interesting line about this, book 1, let's see, that's 18. And this is paragraph 29, middle of paragraph 29. So it's the paragraph right before 19. And he's talking about knowledge of letters. And he says, obviously the knowledge of letters is not more deeply engraved in us than the law of conscience against doing to another what one would not bear if done to oneself. And so it's interesting there, and this is the Romans 2:15 tie-in, that he doesn't use the words what God told us. It is written in our conscience. This law is written into our conscience that we would not do to someone else what we don't want done to us. And that the punishment, right, is this disorder of the soul is its own punishment. And so you have there some kind of a priori without God's law formulation, or what's the word I'm looking for? Postulate of there is some kind of law that is innate in the human soul, if you want to call it that. And so this is where I get confused, right? It's if we're based, right? He talks about the sins of Adam in book 1. If we're base, if we've fallen, then how do we have this conscience that's got the law written in it, right? How do we have a disorder of the soul? Why don't we revel in these sins? And what is the part that kind of reveled in the stealing of the pears if the disorder of our own soul is punishment in and of itself?
I don't see why we couldn't. So you have an issue with him saying that. Where was that again exactly? Where you're saying that God gives us this consciousness?
This is 118, paragraph 29 in my translation. It's the paragraph right before book 19. It's right in the middle. Obviously, the knowledge of letters is not more deeply engraved in us than the law of conscience, against doing to another what one would not bear if done to oneself.
So the issue is that at the same time, we're human beings and able to do all these sorts of bad things at any moment. That's the kind of conflict that is going to work out, right?
Well, it's apparently we can go steal pears and really dig it.
Yeah.
But that there's a law in our conscience that says that we should treat others as we want to be treated. And that
but we don't always follow it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we all know this from our own life, that we might know what the right thing is, but we don't always do it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's like a Socratic thing where we just don't know it at all. We're just ignorant. That's why we do bad things.
Possible. Yeah, I'm just trying to tease through that, right? And it comes back to that idea of righteousness. You know, like Solomon, or let's take David. You know, like David can lay with another man's wife, send him to the front line so that he's killed, but he's still righteous in God's eyes. He's still just. But the law is written on his conscience. And he's righteous and just. And that can't change, even though God's justice, conception of justice, can change. But
I don't remember the rest of that story, but doesn't David get a comeuppance or something later?
yeah, I think and it backs up the disorder of the soul, right?
Right.
It backs that up. But why is he righteous in God's eyes, but maybe not so much others that would do the same thing?
Maybe because he repents afterwards, you know. So if everyone does something wrong, but some people realize it was wrong and then stop doing it, whereas other people just keep doing the same wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think.
Go ahead.
I think Augustine would agree with you to a large extent, actually, which is that even though we have this law written out in our hearts, we keep on sinning, you know, despite that knowledge, and therefore we can't really help ourselves. Essentially, we can't save ourselves, and I think that's why he thinks grace is so important, because it's really God stepping in where we are incapable. let me see. I remember him talking about that, but let me find out if.
Yeah, find that, because I don't remember grace coming up
Yeah.
in my translation. You know, there is an interesting thing that kind of backs up that idea of repentance, though, and it's book 2:3, where he says, but to whom am I telling this, right? Just kind of his whole spiel. But to whom am I telling this? Not to thee, O my God, but in thy presence I am telling it to my own kind, to the race of men, or rather to that small part of the human race that may come upon these writings. And to what purpose do I tell it? Simply that I and any other who may read may realize out of what depths we must cry to thee. For nothing is more surely heard by thee than a heart that confesses thee and a life in thy faith. So maybe there is that.
Okay, I found the grace section. It's in book 2. He says, what shall I render unto the Lord, that whilst my memory recalls these things, my soul is not affrighted at them? I will love thee, O Lord, and thank thee, and confess unto thy name, because thou hast forgiven me these so great and heinous deeds of mine. To thy grace I ascribe it, and to thy mercy, that thou hast melted away my sins as if it were ice. To thy grace I ascribe also whatsoever I have not done of evil. And then he goes on, but it's pretty clear that, look, I've done all these sins. Why am I not afraid of God's punishment? Not because I'm so great, but because of your grace and mercy.
So I think that, part of an issue in a conception of justice is retribution and punishment, right? Of balancing those scales. So if you steal some pears, and I mean, apparently you do it a bunch of times, and you just say, God, forgive me, is that really balancing the scales of justice? Or is that just something that kind of makes you feel better?
Justice and mercy are not connected.
Yeah.
They're almost opposites, actually.
Yeah. No, I would agree.
He goes into this idea that we have a conscience and can be fully aware of our wrongdoings. Book 1, chapter 18, about 3 paragraphs in. Let's see. As if any man should think his enemy to be more pernicious to him than that hatred of his own is, whereby he is set against him. Or imagine that he does worse scath to another man by persecuting him than he does to his own heart by contriving enmity against him. Certainly there is no more inward knowledge of letters than the law of conscience, that one is doing to another what himself would not suffer. How secret art thou, O thou only great God, which dwellest in the highest and in silence with an untiring destiny, dispersing blindness for punishments upon unlawful desires. So, we've got a corrupted nature that seeks to sin. We have a conscience that makes us aware of it. And wasn't Augustine the guy that prayed, give me chastity, but not quite yet?
Yeah, if you're ever going to have a famous one-liner, that's a great one.
I thought that was the Manichaeans, but
oh no, that was Augustine.
That was?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like Will Rogers was really upset that he didn't come up with that. Yeah, I mean, there's also this, and I like that in there. That was the conscience line that I mentioned earlier, Jim. But I like that part that you read after that, which is, how hidden art thou, O God, the only great, dwelling in silence in the high places, and by thy untiring law sending blindness as the punishment for unlawful lusts. So it seems like, similar to the idea of like changing customs and changing justice, is that there's an obfuscation, or not an obfuscation, there's some mystery there, right? And it kind of comes back to that Corinthians verse that I read about, when God comes back, he'll explain everything. That seems somewhat unsatisfying to me, if you have access to an all-knowing God that's everywhere and in you and in hell, one would think that he would have a fairly concrete sense of justice and be able to explain it fairly well.
I think part of this that makes this so confusing is that when we're talking about justice and God's justice, that like you had said earlier that, you know, I steal the pear and then I just ask for forgiveness and get forgiven. That doesn't really seem very just, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but this is, I think that's to the point that Augustine is making, is that our ideas of justice may have no connection at all to what God's version of justice might be. So maybe we do actually think that we really ought to get our ass kicked a lot more than we should, but that really, you know, in the idea of Christianity is that if you just ask for forgiveness and actually want to be forgiven, then you'll have it. I mean, there's passages I could remember them off the top of my head, but, you know, Jesus, the woman is coming to Jesus and she just says, you know, I believe in you or whatever, and he says you are already forgiven. You're already forgiven. You don't have to do anything else just because you acted as if you were. So it is this confusing thing where our idea of justice doesn't match up.
Does it have to, though? It seems that justice is more of a terrestrial virtue, and mercy is more of a spiritual situation. You know, the render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. God, and you got the switch over from the Old Testament to the New Testament, where God changes from a wrathful God to a merciful God.
Yeah, that's exactly that.
He's right at the flux point of that transition. Augustine, the interpretation of the New Testament or the apostles was just being clarified at the time he was living.
And I think that's another reason that we, especially now in like the 21st century, where Christianity is like the de facto like moral hierarchy or moral schema that we all live in. I think we always try and fit it onto the way we want to make the rules and the laws about our society. Is all right, how does Christianity inform these, or how does it hinder them? You know, in the sense that we were talking about homosexuality earlier, but I don't know the history of early Christianity that well, but this kind of way of thinking about the divine is much more of an internal kind of personal relationship than the religious systems that might have been there before, and maybe that's why we have such a hard time making them generally applicable to whole societies or communities of people, is because they don't make sense at that level. If that makes any sense.
Well, that's why we're here, Sam, trying to make sense of it.
Right, because you wouldn't like if a whole group of people were out there, you know, bashing people's heads in or anything, you wouldn't just be like, oh well, you're all forgiven, it's all right, you're off the hook. We would have to put them away. We'd have to lock them up or something like that. But you know, if they have their own little conversion or something like that, they can feel and be forgiven in their own minds or something like that. And I people make fun of that, obviously, but it does happen, I guess, for some people.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of how to tackle this. Like, he's trying to examine his nature, right? Which he extrapolates as human nature. I think part of the reason why, we're reading this now, 1,600 years later, is because it potentially does touch on some part of, what all of us experience. But I'm also trying to get to, like, what are what are his premises? You know, what are his givens? What are his postulates? And then just do his theories that he's extrapolating from those make any sense? And so, you know, even though we've heard it, I'm sure, multiple times about, you know, sins of the flesh and lust and things like that. Like, what's bad about that? Like, what's bad about sex exactly? You know, like, I'm on board that rape is bad. I'm on board with that. But, you know, when you're a teenager, like, it seems to be a physiological thing that happens. And what's bad about it? And so is that a conscience that's, you know, is that part of our conscience written into our soul that we should only have, you know, one man and one woman and cleave to them? Or is that a tribal norm that some tribes hold to more than others, and it's kind of placed upon people in that tribe, but it doesn't necessarily make sense from a design standpoint?
Well, I think it does actually make sense from a biological point of view. If you think of the risk, you know, without birth control, of having children, and then not having a stable family to support them.
Yeah, but if you look at it from a species standpoint, you know, like, what species doesn't want to and isn't designed to propagate as profusely as possible to ensure their survival? And so to say, you know, we as humans shouldn't do that, when the biological design of every other species in nature is to maximize that reproduction as much as resources will allow, and that there's a natural kind of balance that you strike with your environment.
Well, I mean, I think you just said it right there. There's a there's a natural balance that you strike with your environment and the resources that it allows, I think. And we, of course, have maybe made norms that kind of allow us to cope with those boundaries that are already there in the first place. I mean, I think it would be utter chaos if everybody was having sex as much as they wanted to all the time.
Sam, I'm pretty sure that's already happening, bro. Like,
nothing would happen if we all had sex all the time. There'd be nobody driving. There'd be nobody flying.
Pretty sure that I have a feeling you would be surprised. Like,
Be some multitasking going on.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But you understand what I mean. Like, you can't just give in to the things that you want to do all the time just because you want to do them.
Yeah. But I also think that, you know, potentially arbitrary or divine instruction contrary to nature, right? Contrary to one's nature, which we see in his schooling, right? Which is, no, you gotta learn math. I don't want to learn math. I want to read Virgil. Like, where's the harm there? Where's the injustice that he needs to be punished for by wanting to study Virgil and wanting to go to plays instead of learning math? Why does he need to get beat because of that? And if you want to have sex, like, what's the harm in just the sex act in and of itself? Let's just get rid of all the, oh, well, what about this scenario and this scenario? What is the harm in sex itself?
I don't know if he has does he have an idea that the act itself, or that in itself is bad? I mean, he
outside of the institution of marriage, he definitely does.
Right.
And I think to some degree it's the frenzied aspect, right? It's the fact that he can't maybe control the fact that he's thinking about it all the time. It's not even the act itself, you know, that he comes down against necessarily. It's the fact that he can't stop thinking about the act, that he puts himself consistently in groups that, you know, are infatuated with the act. And so I can see that, you know, a certain degree of temperance and moderation, so that you literally can't do anything but that, could potentially cause some harm. But I'm wondering about, you know, is there an argument in the sense of, universal justice in and of itself that can be contrary to the sex act. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there is, if you think of the possibility of raising children without a home.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even today, to this day, with birth control, if you look at single family homes, where there's or broken homes, the children don't do as well on average, not necessarily, as homes with intact families.
Okay.
So imagine how much more that would have been true before birth control. What chaos it would have created for society. People were just having sex with whomever they wanted and just having kids left and right who weren't being taken care of.
Okay.
But there's so many instances of situations where that wasn't an issue. To me, it's a case of biology against custom. Religion has just superimposed itself to reinforce custom. You look at the Spartans; they took the children away from the birth mother and raised them in a common setting until they were 29, 30 years old. They didn't have a family. They didn't really. I guess the council had to approve who mated. There's evidence of monogamy and polygamy and all types of species, and different cultures make different things work. There's cultures in Africa where once a man does the passage to manhood, he's entitled to have sex with any adult woman in the tribe, a woman that's deemed adult. There are places where you put your life on your line if you have sex before marriage. So to me, religion is just an afterthought of how to enforce custom that's been pounded into us.
And there's also something in the kind of forbidden that's inherently attractive, right? Like Adam and Eve were allowed to notionally like bang their brains out however much they wanted, but it's like, don't eat that pear, right? Don't do that. I'm like, okay, they did it. And then with religion, it's somewhat similar, right? I mean, it's like, all right, you can do a lot of stuff, but don't have sex. Like, don't do the thing that you're like 100% designed to do. Don't do that. You can do a lot of other stuff, but don't do that. And especially don't do it if you're a dude with another dude. Don't do that. Like that's even worse. So it's,
I mean,
yeah.
But then again, Brian, just the symposium in the Greek culture, that wasn't such a bad thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, the whole symposium was just about like, how do we appropriately set up these like old dude, young dude relationships? What's up, Russ?
Not that young. I look younger than I am.
How do we set these up appropriately? Like they're happening, but what's a good way to do it? What's a bad way to do it? I wish you'd been there, Russ. Would love your thoughts.
In special cases, Russ, you don't have to be that young.
Oh, God. I don't remember reading that, but
well, but even in the symposium, though, I mean, they do make distinctions between the earthly Aphrodite and the heavenly Aphrodite. It's not like even the Greeks were without this notion that there are some kinds of love that are better than others. So I think the Augustine's idea or the Christian idea isn't really. I don't think it's really that far off for them to ask for this type of moderation, and everybody, I think everybody harps on about the sexual side about it a lot, but there's plenty of other stuff that we could probably do with a little less of in society and culture.
Well, but I think even Augustine, and he might do this accidentally, doesn't necessarily make a huge difference between what we might call a lower Aphrodite and a higher Aphrodite, right? If you look at 3:1, he's talking about, I came to Carthage where a cauldron of illicit loves leapt and boiled about me, which is a great first line of a novel, I think. So you guys want to use that? I'm sold on the first line. I was not yet in love, but I was in love with love, and from the very depth of my need, hated myself for not more keenly feeling the need. I sought some object to love, since I was thus in love with loving, and I hated security and a life with no snares for my feet. For within I was hungry, all for the one of that spiritual food, which is thyself, my God. Yet though I was hungry for one of it, I did not hunger for it. I had no desire whatever for the incorruptible food, not because I had it in abundance, but the emptier I was, the more I hated the thought of it. So this is another example of contradiction. Incorruptible food, right? Like that's, I get what we're metaphorizing here. And he's talking about some kind of divine relationship with God, some kind of love relationship with God. It's also, just as an aside, since we're almost at the end anyway, it's if you reread this in a creepy kind of way, it's a very sexual relationship between Augustine and God. I might edit that part out later, but it's reread book 1 with that in the back of your head, and you're going to go, this is weird. But it's also, in here, he's talking about carnal love. And he says, carnal, just past that, because of all this, my soul was sick and broke out in sores, whose itch I agonized to scratch with the rub of carnal things. Carnal, if there was no soul in them, they would not be objects of love. My longing then was to love and to be loved, but most when I obtained the enjoyment of the body of the person who loved me. So there's a separation there in that last line, right? My longing then was to love and to be loved, but most when I obtained the enjoyment of the body of the person who loved me. So there's, right in that sentence, it seems to me, is a separation between the higher Aphrodite and the lower Aphrodite, and also some sense that they're intertwined, perhaps, right? That there is some level of emotional or spiritual love that to some degree correlates with the sex act, right? That those two things are intertwined to some degree. And so you make that argument, you say, yeah, okay, I mean, that isn't too far from a heterodox Christian view of the emotional being tied in with the sex act. You can just only do it with one person. But it's at least some, I think, admission that they are tied together in some degree. And so then it's even more, why is that bad? Why is that inherently bad if there is some higher Aphrodite that comes with the lower?
He seems to say that if you start with friendship, that's higher, and once you enter into a sexual relationship, you go to the lower. Whereas in Plato, the latter was the opposite. Could I just read what you read, the first sentence? My translation carries this food metaphor. I just thought it was funny. To Carthage I came, where a whole frying pan full of abominable love crackled around and about me and on every side.
Like
mine says a cauldron.
That cauldron too.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's no such thing as incorruptible food, right? So it's obvious. I mean, I just pointed out just because I'm talking about contradictions. And so this conception of some kind of divine love that's always there and will never spoil, as opposed to potentially the consummation of the sex act, where it's like once it happens, you're like, okay, I'm good.
It's kind of interesting how this compares to the symposium. You said earlier that you didn't find any declarative sentence from Socrates in the symposium. Mm-hmm. But I went back and looked at it, and he says, I don't know what love is, but I know what the art of love is. And here, and he goes on to explain that if you can talk to your young man in a way that is philosophical, he will be forced to come to love you. And it seems like Augustine is talking a little bit the same way. But this filthy and dishonest as I was, with a superlative kind of vanity, I took a pride to pass for a spruce and gentle companion. I forced myself also into love, with which I affected to be ensnared. So he had his way of seducing he chose to be a gentleman. He chose to be clean. He chose to be gentle. He knew what he had to do to get what he wanted.
Mm-hmm. Philosophers spit mad game, I think, is what we're saying.
It's interesting how Socrates was telling, who was he, Ty? I don't remember who he was telling it to, but the same.
Alcibiades? Good old Alcibiades?
I don't think Alcibiades had showed up yet when he was doing his speech.
Yeah.
He was talking to the priestess. I forget what her name is.
Diotima.
Diotima, that's right.
But there's another comparison here. Augustine kind of knew what he had to do, but didn't want to do it. And Alcibiades was told by Socrates what he needed to do, and he didn't want to do it either. He wanted to keep within the affection of the people and not raise himself to the level of being a philosopher.
Crash dinner parties.
Yeah. That was funny too, just because the beginning of the thing talked about the lesser man crashes dinner parties, and then Alcibiades crashes the dinner party. Anyway, Sam, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to talk more about how I liked how Alcibiades is like the failure of a philosopher who wants to reach for the divine. Just and it reminded me of this just because Augustine. It reminds me of Augustine here. He seems to be really, really engulfed in his lusts and his desires, but he's still trying to grab on. And in his mind, the thing that he's grabbing onto that's staying him and making it more permanent is God. And I guess for back when we were reading the Symposium, it was this similarly ethereal notion of beauty and the good and the abstract, all that kind of stuff that we were struggling to figure out what the hell he's talking about.
Right. Well, it's the idea of higher and low. It's the ladder of love, really, is what it is. The idea of higher and lower desires. And then, Augustine's saying that, hold on. If he had a famine of that inward food, thyself, my God. So basically he's saying that even though he was fulfilled in other ways, he still had this lacking. Right. So he's saying that the love of God is the highest love, that without which you will always be lacking, which is kind of similar to the idea of Socrates' idea of understanding the good, the highest good.
Yeah, and there's a lot of parallels here, which I'm glad we're teasing out, because it helps kind of to hold both works up against each other and kind of tease out the similarities and the differences. We're at 9:30. I think we just lost Jim too. So I don't know what you said, Russ, but apparently he was just done. Not the first time. Hey, thank you guys so much for showing up. I appreciate it. We got Ego and Id next month, and then Modern Man in Search of a Soul the month after that, where I think we're going to see a lot of the same kind of theories of human nature and what is higher love and lower love. We're just going to keep tracking on that. So thanks for showing up. And any last questions, or we'll just wrap it up?
I had a quick question about we can talk more off the cam here. But
nobody's going to make it this far, Sam. So
how do we maybe suggest stuff for next time, further readings? I
can do it right now.
Yeah, the latest thing was that Freud and the Jung. So I don't know if anybody had any ideas for other.
Yeah, I mean, whatever you guys want to tackle in January. If you want to, we don't have anything scheduled right now. So if you guys want to throw out some suggestions of stuff you'd like to work on.
Okay.
Anything top of mind that you want to dig into, Sam?
I had been trying to read some Kierkegaard, and I
thought you were going to say Hegel. I was just like, no, we're not doing it.
No.
Kierkegaard's like number 2 on that list.
Yeah, so maybe not that, but maybe.
No, I'm down. I mean, that's why we got to do this stuff. Is we got to do it, in the seminar style, and we got to do it together. Otherwise, there's no chance we're going to make it through the reading.
Either that or some political stuff. If anybody's still feeling civical after this election.
Oh God. I mean, I always dig like doing Mill and Locke and de Tocqueville. So anything, in that kind of realm, I'm interested in. What were you thinking, Sam, as far as the political?
Any of that kind of stuff. I mean, I haven't read much of it at all. So, I mean,
Okay.
I was just going to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could do, if we wanted to do, like we were trying to do a lot of, this semester, we might want to call it, these first 6 were really just kind of like generally, all right, let's talk about human nature a little bit, which is why, I wanted to do at least an Augustine or an Aquinas, because I didn't want to completely ignore kind of the religious tradition. But if we wanted to do a political series for next semester, I mean, we could very easily start in something like the Republic and then, work our way up to de Tocqueville kind of thing. Kierkegaard.
Guys, I gotta go. Told my
yeah.
wife to be done at 10:30. Thank you.
Tell them Nora I said hey.
I will.
So if we wanted to do like a political series next semester, I mean, I could try to jam some Kierkegaard in there if you have any specific reading that you're interested in. Excuse me. We could try to do that.
Yeah, the one I was trying to I have this kind of collected works of Kierkegaard, and I was just trying to read through some of it, and where I stopped was on his dissertation on Socrates, and I don't even think the whole thing was included in this collection. I don't know how long his thesis was, but I think it's only an abridgment. But even that, I was struggling to understand.
Something I really like to do. It's great. It's a great way to cheat, Sam. Is look at the St. John's syllabus.
What's that?
I said, just Google like the St. John's College syllabus.
Oh, St. John's. Okay.
Yeah, that's where I went to grad school. And the more kind of not obscure philosophers, but I would say maybe the less read philosophers, like your Kierkegaard, they will usually put the best parts in their syllabus. And so rather than starting on page 1, chapter 1 of, Kierkegaard's collected works, you can basically just look in there, and there'll usually be like a 30-page reading that's a good introduction to like Kierkegaard. And it's not, it's Kierkegaard's writing, but it's a good, like, here's what's going on with Kierkegaard.
Yeah. That's why I like this this book that I have. It wasn't it's not like it's not like a tome of all of his stuff. I think it's
specific selected writings.
I think at least that was the author's intent. That was somebody be able to pick it up and to the at the time, but
Jim, we're just talking about what we potentially want to do for next quote unquote semester, like January, starting in January. So
yeah, we had a lightning flash here. I lost the internet for a few minutes.
Good times. So we were talking about Sam was talking about how he'd like to dig into some Kierkegaard, and he'd also like to dig into some political writings. So we were talking about how we could, I'm trying to go a little thematic, just because I feel like that helps with the hook of getting people interested. So, this first 6 months was kind of like, let's survey, some kind of conception of human nature. And so if we wanted to pitch it as, let's talk about the philosophy of politics for like the next 6 months, I think that would be a good hook. And we might, we could do that, and then we could say, all right, we're going to do an elective Kierkegaard, and just drop it in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, and you don't have to like shoehorn Kierkegaard in there just for.
No, it's cool. I'm not going to read it unless we do a seminar on it. Like that's people like Brian, you read a lot, and I'm like, dude, I only read for seminars pretty much. Like I sign up for them to make myself read them, because if I don't sign up, I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to read like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. If you don't, if I don't have these seminars to like, make me do it. So I'll take a look at that. I mean, Jim, you got any thoughts on anything you want to dig into next semester? We don't have to do this theme thing. We can just grab whatever we want to grab.
I'm game for just about anything. I like the classical philosophers because I'm relatively new to this, and it just helps me build a foundation for the other stuff. But I've read stuff like little dabs of Schopenhauer. He's an interesting writer. Kierkegaard certainly was an interesting dude. People tell me Nietzsche is terrific to read. I've never read any of it.
Yeah.
I'm open. So
Okay. All right. Well, let's just meditate on that, and then if you guys just want to post in the forum, you know, in our last little, I feel like I put up the Freud.
Yeah.
Did I put it up?
I don't know.
I don't know about the text, but you put the topic up.
Oh, okay. I did. Intro readings of philosophy.
I don't think it's up here yet. The Freud. No.
Augustine, Plato, Sisyphus. Yeah, it's not in there. I might have just made a comment that we were going to do that within the St. Augustine. So I'll put the Freud up tonight. I might actually not put it up tonight. I'll email it out when I put it up, just because I want to double check that the reading length is going to be doable. I feel like I checked it like a couple of months ago, and I was like, yeah, we can do this, but I don't want the stuff to be too long and like turn people off. So I don't have a hard copy with me, but I have a hard copy at home. So I'll be home on like Thursday, and I can check that out.
Yeah, I just mentioned this. We're talking about the Mino with my friend in China, and he told me that as a alumni, he gets access to certain free e-courses that the staff puts on, and they're currently offering one on the Mino. So I looked it up, and the guy that he was talking about recorded 16 sessions on the Mino in 1966, 24 hours on the Mino.
Wow.
I says, I've read it. There must be a hell of a lot that I missed.
Well, that's the thing, you know, like I know we're running late here, so I won't bend your ear too much about this, but the whole reason I got into this because I run a program called Combat and Classics. Mm-hmm. And our prospectus that I send out every year that just kind of lays out what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what we're reading, kind of talks about military learning structure, which I had to suffer through for a long time. I was in the Marines for 13 years. And everything we learn has what's called terminal learning objectives and enabling learning objectives. Like, here's what you need to learn from whatever you're doing, right? And I said at Combat and Classics, we reject this idea because there's no terminus to the great books, right? There's no I'm done learning about this, right? And the 24 hours on the Mino is an example, right? Like, you could absolutely do like 24 hours of lectures on the Mino. I can't do that. But like, you could literally do the Mino 24 seminars on the Mino and get something new out of it every time. Like my buddy Aaron Ross Powell works over at the Cato Institute, and he runs the intern like onboarding program, and they actually read the Mino as part of the intern onboarding program, and he does that every year. Mm-hmm. And still isn't tired of it. Just because, like, you can, with the type of books that we're trying to tackle here, and the type of books we try to tackle in Combat and Classics, and the type of books that we do at St. John's, like, you can literally read that stuff again and again and again and again and again, and you're never going to get to the end of what's there, which is kind of groovy, you know?
Yeah, the University of Chicago Extension School, Adult Continuing Education, mm-hmm. that is the primary requisite that you go through a 10-week course on the Mino mm-hmm. prior to being admitted into the program.
That's awesome.
Or contiguous with the first semester.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool. Cool. All right, guys. Well, I'll be on touch online. We'll put up the Freud thing by the end of the week, and then we can just talk about future ops next semester after that.
Sure.
Very good.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Brian.
See ya.